All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. I'd like to thank everybody for joining me on Interphex Thursday here for this little discussion on data integrity. The title of this presentation is Reducing Business Risk and Improving Data Integrity through CGMP, Current Good Manufacturing Practices, and Meeting FDA ALCOA Plus Requirements. My apologies for that title. It's a little bit long. I tried to put as many buzzwords in there as I could that relate to this topic. Then I went around thinking about shortening it, but it was too late. We're going to talk a lot about data integrity and how it applies to life science companies that are, let's face it, in a heavily regulated industry. And again, just thanks everybody for joining me. Data integrity is very important to regulated life science businesses. We're all very responsible for making sure that data is protected, it's accurate, it's not deleted, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong that could possibly risk data integrity within the business. Obviously, the first one that comes to mind is human error. I know we've all been victim of the keyboard fat finger syndrome. It's easy for people to make mistakes when they're entering data. There's also the issue of ignorance in some cases. Perhaps people are poorly trained on what they need to do. Perhaps they're not fully informed on regulatory issues associated with the data that they're responsible for recording. And then there's always the fraudulent sort of data manipulation, which the legal folks in the room might be inclined to call fraud with intent to deceit. You don't get too much of that. A lot of that's unintentional, but there are a lot of ways that this can manifest itself. When you're in a more manual system, it's very easy when recording data to get things in the wrong place at the wrong time and misrepresent actually what happened. But it's also the systems we automate too. There's a lot of automation in this industry, and it's very common, or it's not very common, but data integrity can be compromised when systems share data and something breaks down in the middle between the systems. Sometimes coding issues might introduce or malware might introduce some sort of change to data, and then you always have the risk of when you're upgrading your systems, maybe the data isn't necessarily corrupted, there's no loss of data integrity, but perhaps you end up in a situation where the data you once used to have access to, you no longer have access to because you're on a new system. So there's just a host of things that can go wrong to compromise data integrity within our business. So the end result can be, because we're in a regulated industry and the regulating body for most of us in this room is the FDA, the risk is that you can end up with one of these 483 warning letters, and the category of data integrity or lack of data integrity is a growing category within the FDA 483 warning letter world. Imagine yourself being a president or a CEO of a company, and you receive one of these letters from the FDA. These letters actually go to the big kahuna in the company. It doesn't go to a quality guy or a validation engineer or validation manager or anything like that. These go straight to the top. And they can come to a company on a manner of different tones. They may simply be, hey, remember me? I'm your friendly FDA auditor. I was in about a month ago, and we kind of really don't like this too much. You might want to think about changing it. Or the message can be, hey, I'm your auditor. I was in about a month ago, and this is just totally unacceptable. You have to stop manufacture right now and start getting your remediation actions in line. And it can even take the next step, although I think it's not very common. You can be subject to a situation where something that you may be doing in your manufacturing area is such a significant breakdown in patient safety or product quality that there could be potential criminal actions involved. So, or criminal litigation charges involved. So these things are fairly serious, and it gets a little worse than that if you're a company that's subject to this, because this is not a private thing that you receive from the FDA. The FDA posts these 483 warning letters on their website for anybody to view, and if you get a chance, go to the website and walk through some of these things. They are kind of interesting. This chart I put up here is kind of hard to read, so I think I'll just explain it to you. The top chart's probably the most significant one. It speaks to the increasing quantity of 483 warning letters that are related to data integrity. Between 2000 and 2012, it was really just a handful that would go out annually that were related to data integrity, usually single digits. But from 2013 and onward, it's been increasing to a point that in 2016, data integrity issues accounted for 1/3 of the 483 warning letters. And in particular, you can't really see the bar graphs pretty easy there, but in 2016, from left to right, the countries that are getting audited the most are China, India, and the US, in that order. Now, there's a number of reasons for this escalation. One is that the U.S. and is where a lot of these pharmaceuticals are manufactured, so you'd expect the U.S. to be high quantity. There's a lot of offshore, especially generics, manufacturing going on in India, China, and that's increased over time, so you'd expect some pretty high numbers in those countries. But the other interesting thing is that right about, I think, that 2013 timeframe, FDA started giving their auditors more training to look for data integrity issues. And the big reason for this is that over time, the industry has gradually moved from paper data to digitized or electronic records. And that's pretty key, because paper is less regulated by the FDA. It kind of comes into scope within 21 CFR Part 11, but kind of doesn't. The primary scope within 21 CFR Part 11 regulatory compliance is about electronic data. So it was necessary to make sure FDA auditors are getting the right level of training on that. So they beefed that up. So anytime you give somebody more training on that subject, it's likely you're going to see more observances and minor nonconformances and major nonconformances from the audit come out that are associated with data integrity. So it's a pretty interesting concern, and as I said earlier, these things are all public, so everybody can see what's going on. Within my business, I have a little bit of a sales role, so I hit this about once a month because I want to see who's gotten the 483 letter. My business can help people both from an equipment standpoint and also from validation standpoint with helping people meet validation requirements. And if any of you guys are in that same boat, it's a great place to go look for potential clients, quite frankly. Now, the FDA is not the bad guy in this. We're in this regulatory environment, and there's a tendency to say, oh my God, this stuff is such a pain. Why do I have to deal with this? I'm a good manufacturer. Why do I have this burden? But as I understand it, 21 CFR Part 11 wasn't always there, and back then you were subject to the whims of auditors. So you might have an auditor that views a particular part of your manufacturing process and says it's perfectly fine 1 year, and then the next year another guy comes in and he has a big objection with the exact same process. So 21 CFR Part 11 regulation and the validation and documentation engineering practice that we go through in order to make sure we're in compliance is a very good thing, and because it speaks to making sure that we're adhering to not only patient safety issues but product quality issues as well. And the FDA understands that the manufacturers are not the bad guys either. Everybody's trying to make good product for the most product. Sometimes we might just not have good practices. So a very important part of any 483 letter that a company might receive are the remediation actions recommended by the FDA. You can't read this, but you can download the PowerPoint sometime later if you want to from Interphex, I believe. But on the right is a very good example of some of the remediation actions that are recommended by the FDA. The problem with all this is nobody really plans in their business for the resource needed and for the time needed and the cost needed associated with remediation actions. So you want to do whatever you can to avoid this sort of thing, because forcing your quality guy to have to deal with this sort of thing is going to take him from other things that you might want to have him spending his time on. These are some actual extractions that show the gravity of some of the things that FDA inspectors actually find. This one, manipulation, backdating, and falsification of good manufacturing practice documents. This is just a huge no-no. Nobody should ever be doing this, but sometimes it has to do with how automated your systems are. There's still a lot of systems out there that require manual dating of things, and one of the biggest traps that you can fall into is that you get busy. You know, humans have multiple jobs and multiple hats they wear within the business, and if you're forced to do an automaton's job, you sit there and watch that process, and the second something happens, you record it, and you date it, and you timestamp it. But we don't have that luxury, and a lot of times what ends up happening in manual data recording situations, you end up with let's wait till the process is finished and then we'll go take care of all the data recording, and errors occur when that happens. The other example to the right here deals with shared logins. That's one of the biggest no-nos in data integrity and guidance, because you have no attributability. If you've got operators and supervisors that are required by 21 CFR Part 11 compliance issues related to electronic signature, if they've got logins that they're sharing, then you never really can look back on that data and have a good feeling and a good understanding for who actually recorded it and maybe when it was actually recorded. Retesting samples until you get acceptable results, that's not a very good thing to be doing, but it happens. And then this whole issue about not having your data recording automated enough, you can end up in situations where you end up with partial data, everything's not necessarily complete, there may be some blank spots, and it just ends up with trouble when you get to that auditing standpoint. Now, the really good news about this is there's been a wealth of guidance that has come down from the regulatory bodies in the last few years. And when I mention regulatory bodies, there's really two places this guidance is coming from. One is from the regulatory organizations like the FDA, and it's not just them, but MHRA in the UK, EMA in Europe, I believe CFDA is an Indian regulatory organization. All of those folks, beginning in about 2016, began bringing down draft guidance, or handing down draft guidance related to data integrity issues. And most of them now, I believe the FDA's draft guidance that came down in 2016 was made formal and final at the end of 2018. So it's really interesting when you look at it, because there's a date on the MHRA of March 2016, I believe. The FDA guidance was April 2016. World Health Organization was June 2016, and on and on. It's almost like they all got together, looked at one document, scattered it out a couple months, and made their own release. They do offer the guidance on data integrity with a slightly different focus. I was reading an online article just a few days ago on the differences between 21 CFR Part 11 and Annex 11. which comes out of Europe. 21 CFR Part 11 reads more as a thou shalt do it this way, where Annex 11 is a little bit more of a how-to. So you get presentations from these regulatory bodies on different tones like that. But the great thing is that there's a lot of conversions there internationally. They've all come together pretty nicely. So you got the regulatory bodies pretty much getting all together on one page with respect to data integrity. But there's also good guidance coming down from the market associations. The one that I know we pay mostly attention to here in the U.S. is ISPE. ISPE has some very good documents on data integrity. They just came out with a new one a couple months ago that covers all of the good practice issues related to data integrity in a very comprehensive and understandable way. So the good news is or the struggling news or challenging news is that it's important, and you got to pay a lot of focus on this. The good news is there's a lot of guidance to make sure you can do it right. And in the guidance, the one that we pay the most attention to is, as you might guess, is the FDA's guidance, which was made formal and final back in, I think it was November of 2018. That guidance helps you answer questions that you see up here. You know, what electronic copies can be used as accurate production? You know, what constitutes the raw data, the source data, or the data of record, if you will. I've heard it called many different things. How often do audit trails need to be reviewed, and all those sort of things are covered in that guidance document. But probably the biggest and the most beneficial thing that's come down through all that is the use of a 5-letter acronym that is called ALCOA. Has absolutely nothing to do with aluminum manufacturing. And in fact, ALCOA as a 5-letter acronym has been around since the 90s, but it's been adopted more recently by regulatory bodies as even a more basic and comprehensive methodology, user-friendly methodology, guidance, if you will, for making sure that you're paying attention to data integrity issues. I'm not sure when it came about, but I think it probably came into play with the FDA's draft guidance back in 2016. But they felt that they needed to put a plus on the end of ALCOA. Thankfully, they didn't turn it into a 9 or 10-letter acronym that would have been just impossible to remember. So there are a few bullet points associated with ALCOA Plus that are in addition, and I'll touch on all of these briefly. But ALCOA is something that's very important to keep in mind as we all march towards Pharma 4.0 system automation upgrades. Pharma 4.0 is another one of those buzzwords that are floating around the industry. It means a lot of things to a lot of different things to a lot of people. But for somebody who's updating in their plant either a process control system that needs to be validated or a process monitoring system that needs to be validated, you're going to be spending some money with automation companies. And you need to make sure that what you get from those automation companies is going to meet your business's data integrity requirements. And that may vary from business to business. Another little side note, this is one of my favorite slides. I've got an engineering background, and years ago I was told that you should never have a technical presentation unless it has some system architecture diagrams in it. So this validates my technical presentation since I've put up a system architecture diagram. Now this is one of ours, but this could be anybody's system diagram. And it's very typical. You've got instrumentation on that bottom rung. That speaks to PLCs, programmable automation controllers, data recorders, other kind of process controllers. That's the sort of information that's doing the collection of data. The middle layer starts to get up into the system, if you will, where you have a box such as this one here that's your primary data collector. He's the one that's got all the real-time data. And sometimes, you know, that one's so important that it's often made redundant, and there's another one sitting off to the side that's doing the exact same job in case the other one fails. But that's where all your real-time data is coming in. That's where maybe your SQL database is constantly being updated. But off to the side, if you've got a batch process, you might have a batch server. The historian is key because that's where we get data integrity from saving all of our data in a very secure way. So all those things are just incredibly important in this design. Above that, you end up with clients, you know, people in different rooms that actually can access the system and see things using mimics and data tables and all that sort of thing. But at the end of the day, as you try, whether you're upgrading a facility or you got a new facility going in, you need to look at these systems that the automation providers are pitching to you to make sure that they're going to meet those data integrity requirements. And ALCOA is a really great way to put a litmus test on that whole exercise. So let me just get into the acronyms and give you just a brief understanding of what they are. The first A in ALCOA is for attributable, and we spoke a little bit earlier about this. This is highly important because when you have people sharing passwords, you really don't have a good understanding of how things have changed in the system over time. And there's really it reduces the accountability of your operators and your supervisors in a very significant way. So it's very important that your system that you select has significant password authentication. A lot of us are with large corporations, significant IT departments. You've got corporate computers you're using. You have to log onto those computers. After 3 months or so, they force you to change your password. At my business, we just went through a situation. I had to change my password, and I'm entering a new password. I couldn't get it to work. I said, okay, what did they change? My password was a 9-digit password character, uppercase, lowercase alphas, numbers, special characters. I met all the qualifications, but IT changed it to 10 characters from 8. So, and I didn't get the memo on that. So it took me a while to figure that one out. But these are important changes. Those passwords need to expire. People need to be able to go in and incorporate new passwords in the same format. The same sort of password protection we put in our networks, we need to have in place to protect data integrity as well. You know, those IT folks are pretty busy. We don't give them a lot of credit. A lot of us tend to complain about IT folks rather than pat them on the back. I don't know that I've ever patted an IT guy on the back and said, hey, really love that new server you put in, and I was really impressed the way you configured that firewall. They just don't get those kind of comments, and they're off busy doing other things. So creating these accounts for people to access your process monitoring system or your process control system in a validated environment can take some time, and that also puts at place the risk of sharing passwords. So there are risks on this front that you have to adhere to. Another great way to review a new automation system to make sure that it's passing your 4.0 requirements and your data integrity requirements is to make sure that the password system you put in place can take advantage of Microsoft Active Directory. That simply means that the passwords associated with the system can be managed back on the network through Microsoft Active Directory. Not all automation systems out there that you might be thinking about have that capability. The L in ALCOA is for legible. Now, some of this is a throwback to paper recorders. I'm still amazed right now when I'm looking around the industry, especially in the OEM market, how many folks are still using circular paper chart recorders in this industry. But they are going away slowly but surely, and the minute they do and you get into electronic data storage, that's when 21 CFR Part 11 comes into play. That's when data integrity issues become a little bit more significant. So, but paper's still out there, and the problem with paper recording is, you know, it's pen on a piece of paper. that stuff fades over time. The thermic paper that has been used in the past was especially susceptible to that sort of thing. And yet with a data record that might not be terribly legible. But this comes into play with electronic record keeping as well, because those same trend charts that you could generate on paper can be displayed graphically in electronic systems as well, and automation systems. But if you don't have the scaling right on that graph, the information you see may not be very informative and may not be able to tell you what you want to know. The other thing that you want to make sure of in these automation systems is if you are storing data electronically, if it's a new system, you probably will be, that whatever you're using to review that data or generate reports on that data is repeatable and consistent. Because one part of legibility is getting what you expect. The data certainly needs to be accurate, but if you're printing reports that have a chart in the top right-hand corner one day and the same chart in the bottom left-hand corner the next day, and an auditor comes in and starts looking at these reports, he's going to wonder what this is about. Why are things so different from audit to audit? So legibility is a concern. Contemporaneous is the C in ALCOA. Nice, lovely, long word, not one you use in dinner conversation very often, but it's important here. To break it down into a nutshell, this is the difference between, the key difference here is the difference between manual recording of events associated with your process, regardless of whether you're controlling or monitoring, and automated time stamping. Contemporaneous is all about making sure that data is collected and it's recorded either exactly at the time it happens or very close to the time it happens. This is where manual systems get you into trouble, because as I mentioned earlier, humans are busy people, and we have a tendency to procrastinate sometimes, and if you're recording this data manually, you might end up waiting till the end, and you don't have a recording record that necessarily matches the timestamp for when the activity actually occurred. The other thing that comes into play here when you have those larger system architectures like I showed up before is making sure you've got some sort of server in the environment that is performing an SNTP operation, or usually today it's SFTP, but it's a utility within those larger systems that makes sure that all the components, all the computers within the system are on the same time. It doesn't make a lot of sense to do time stamping if your entire system isn't on the same time down to the second. Otherwise, you could end up with erroneous data. Original is, of course, highly important. Original data, raw data, source data, data of record. Businesses will call this something different. But at the end of the day, anybody who's recording data and receiving that data in a CSV or a text file or in an Excel spreadsheet is at risk, because anybody can manipulate that data. Really what you need to have in place is some automation system that records the data but does so in some sort of encrypted way with a binary checksum, so that the original data file is always the original data file. It can never be tampered with. Never say never. We like to call it tamper resistant these days rather than tamper proof. But there are things that you can get out there in the marketplace that will make that data encrypted so nobody can look at it unless they have the right tools. So original data is key, very important. And then the final A in the ALCOA acronym is all about accurate. This speaks largely to the accuracy of the equipment that you're putting in place. I was looking at some sensors the other day for a environmental monitoring system, and I could purchase these sensors with accuracies all the way from 0.5% up to 5%. Obviously the 5% sensors were a lot cheaper, but they're not going to give me perhaps the level of data integrity that my business wants. It could be the 3% sensors are within my company spec, and maybe those are fine. Maybe I don't have to spend the money on the 0.5%. But this speaks largely to accuracy of input, accuracy of the sensors, accuracy of the inputs on the equipment that will be receiving the sensor signals, and all of that sort of thing. But it also speaks a little bit to the human interpretation of readings and things like that as well. There's also accuracies of data that, or risk to accuracy of data that can be compensated with features and benefits found within the automation solutions that you might be considering for purchase. Just one example of this, and something for you to keep in mind. Some automation providers will address this, some won't. What happens in a network system where you're recording data, you've got instrumentation that is connected to sensors, but that instrumentation is then delivering that system to a network. But we all know networks go down from time to time. Call that IT guy who's real busy, comes back, plugs the Cat5 cable back in, and you're back in service again. But during that period, your network, your data server, your data historian had a gap in the data that it was receiving. So how is that gap handled? What's the auditor going to see when he shows up and he sees a gap like that? So the question is, what does the system do? Does it linearly interpolate and draw a line between the last time it saw data and the time it got data back? That's probably not an accurate thing to do, because as you can see, you really have no idea what happened to data during that gap. There are a lot of systems out there that will hold that data in the instrumentation, wait for the network to be reestablished, and then forward it back up to your recording system so that that gap is filled. So there are a lot of little nuances like that you need to look in your automation systems to see if your manufacturer, your automation provider is actually providing you what you need. Now, I mentioned plus. The plus part of the algorithm brings in a few other things. Complete, you really want to make sure the data is all there. If you start a batch and you end a batch and everything's on this during that time, all your data collection, you're probably okay. But sometimes there's a need to retest a particular batch or a particular process. And it's important that not only the original test, but the retest become part of that data that you're collecting. Everything needs to be consistent. This is getting a little bit back to timestamp. However you're collecting your data, you want to be doing it in a repeatable way, the same way all the time. Enduring, however you're recording the data, wherever you're storing it, it needs to be done in a permanent way. A lot of the instrumentation on that lower level of the system architecture will have memory storage within it. A lot of times it's flash memory. Sometimes it can be quite a bit of flash memory. The devices above that, FTP file server, maybe that's the place you save the information. Maybe you want to do that in a secondary way, maybe a secondary FTP file server. Those things are all good, but you have to make sure that however you're recording the data, it's very permanent. And not only permanent, but available. When your auditor comes in, and this is where paper systems are getting replaced on a daily basis. File cabinets are not the best place to keep your records. It's much better to have those in an enduring media that is highly available, easily accessible through whatever tools you have from your automation provider. And then finally, life cycle. The data needs to be available over its life cycle. Now, life cycle is a recent addition to ALCOA Plus. Some folks are paying attention to that, some folks are not. Life cycle speaks to, well, if you have a product life cycle, my company manufactures electronic instrumentation, and we might come out with something in 1998, and by the time we get to 2015, it's had a pretty good life. A lot of the electronic components we used in that you can't get anymore. There's newer ways to do that, more automated that process, more automated ways. So it's time to put that product on the end of its life cycle and let it go to obsolescence. The same thing is true for data. Depending on how you are regulated, you might be required to hold data for a year. You might require to be hold data for 5 years, 7 years. It kind of depends on the regulatory environment that you're subject to. But at the end of the day, that data has a lifespan, and some companies are actually buying into this, where when you reach the end of that, the data goes away. You actually retire the data. With the size of servers we have now and memory storage, you know, maybe that's not so important, you know, data can live forever in theory, but that's another consideration. Now, data integrity does have some adjacent trends that you need to keep in mind that can affect it, and specifically, there's some things we're seeing in the marketplace. One is what I mentioned earlier, is that good engineering practices, good manufacturing practices are not going away, and there's getting a lot more documentation guidance on how to do this right, and there'll be more of that coming along in the future. So I think we're all in a pretty good place on getting really good directions on how to validate our regulated environments. The other thing that we're seeing in the marketplace quite a bit that has an impact on data integrity is the need for cybersecurity. In particular, look for automation manufacturers that are adhering to Achilles certification. I'm not sure if there are many other certifications out there that look at instrumentation's ability to have a high cybersecurity standard, but Achilles is one that my business is using, and I know several of my competitors are using as well. Just about every product we're introducing these days is coming out with an Achilles certification that basically says that it's got a level of, there are elements within the coding that make it less susceptible to a hacking event or a cybersecurity event that could have a negative impact on your business. Let's face it, all these things have an Ethernet port in the back of them these days, and that's all it takes in order for a problem to occur. The other thing is automation providers are putting a lot of new features and new benefits in their products. We're always trying to get a one-up on the competition. And whether it's a feature like I mentioned earlier, like store and forward that fills that data gap, or new and improved ways and more cost-effective ways to accomplish redundancy so that if part of your system goes out, everything keeps running. The features like that are coming on board more and more every day. So keep an eye on those automation providers to see what they actually have to offer you that could help your data integrity scenario. And then finally, the cloud is here without a doubt. My business is doing things in the cloud. I've got competitors doing data integrity plans for people in the cloud. And it's funny, it's 2 years ago, you couldn't have a conversation with a major pharmaceutical manufacturer without an insistence that all their data be locked up on their server. Now those same people now are talking to you and wondering when you're going to have a product that'll let them put their things in the cloud, their data in the cloud. So this is coming at us big time. And as you can see, there's already guidance out there from ISP on the right way, from ISPE on the right ways and the wrong ways to do that. So to close, I just want to let you know how I gather my information. I've got a counterpart in Europe, a gentleman by the name of Sebastian Girard, that's got some really good training from A3P and Coetic, and he helped us put this presentation together. There's another gentleman, a former employee of Schneider Electric, Jonathan Thompson, and his team put together a really good white paper that I'd be happy to share with anyone who wants to get a copy of it, that speaks very much to the issues that we talked about today. And as I mentioned before, there's great guidance documents from ISPE and a host of other people as well as FDA and other regulatory bodies on data integrity and how to get good compliance with 21 CFR Part 11 issues related to data integrity. Now, I'll be here for most of the day, not here, but around. I'm hanging out over in exhibit booth 1663. I'd love to have a deeper conversation with anybody who wants to on this topic. It's kind of my bread and butter these days, and not just from a greedy capitalistic salesman point of view, but I enjoy the topic. I think it's kind of thought-provoking. Thanks, everybody. Like I said, I'm in 1663 if you want to chat more.